The hood of the car was cold, and so was the money spread across it. $17,000, in neat rubber-banded stacks, lay under the flashing lights of a police cruiser on the shoulder of Route 9. An old Buick, dark green, immaculate despite its age, sat with its driver's door open. Standing beside it, hands folded in front of him, was a 71-year-old man named Walter Higgins. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't pleading. He was simply watching, with the kind of stillness that unsettles people who expect fear and don't get it. "Sir, you understand we have every right to hold this," the officer said, tapping the stacks of bills with 2 fingers like he was inspecting produce. His name tag read Doyle. Money like this, moving around like this, it raises questions. Walter didn't answer right away. He looked at the cash, then at the officer, then out at the tree line beyond the shoulder, where the late afternoon light was turning gold. "You're going to want to make a phone call before you do anything with that money," Walter finally said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. Officer Doyle laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Is that a threat, old man?" "No," Walter said. "It's a courtesy." What Officer Doyle didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing there with someone else's life savings in his hands, was that in exactly 19 minutes, his entire career would begin to unravel. And the man responsible for that unraveling was standing 3 feet away from him, patiently waiting to be underestimated one more time. But to understand how Walter Higgins ended up on the side of that road, we have to go back, 3 days back, to a Tuesday morning that started like every other morning of his quiet life. Walter Higgins lived alone in a small brick house on Ashford Street, the same house he'd bought with his late wife, Corinne, 43 years earlier. The neighborhood had changed around him, young families in, older neighbors passing on, but Walter had stayed, tending his tomato plants every summer, waving at the mail carrier by name, sweeping his porch every Sunday whether it needed it or not. If you'd passed him on the street, you might not have looked twice. That was, in a way, exactly how he liked it. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, drove a car that was older than some of his neighbors' children, and paid for his groceries in exact change, counted out slowly and without apology. People who didn't know him sometimes mistook his quietness for simplicity. People who did know him understood it was the opposite, a hard-won, deliberate calm, built over decades of choosing patience over anger, even when anger would have been justified 100 times over. Walter had worked 38 years as a machinist at a manufacturing plant 2 towns over, the kind of job that ate at your hands and your knees but paid steady, if you were careful, if you saved. And Walter had been careful. Every raise, every bit of overtime, every Christmas bonus. A portion had gone quietly into savings, into a modest handful of investments a coworker had once talked him into a life insurance policy he'd paid on faithfully since he was 26 years old. None of that had made him rich, but it had made him steady. And steady, compounded over 45 years, has a way of becoming something people don't expect when they look at an old man in a flannel shirt. There was one more thing about Walter that almost nobody in his day-to-day life knew. Folded into the quiet architecture of his life was a relationship most people would never have guessed at. A connection built not out of money or status, but out of something that happened nearly 30 years ago, when Walter did something for a frightened 19-year-old that the young man never forgot. We'll get to that. But first, you need to understand what set all of this in motion. That Tuesday morning, Walter's granddaughter Jasmine called him with news that would change everything. "Grandpa Walter, it's done," she said, and he could hear the tremble of excitement in her voice, even through the phone. Jasmine, 28 years old, was a junior associate at a law firm downtown, sharp as a blade and twice as stubborn as her grandfather, which was saying something. The estate cleared. Grandma Corinne's sister's house finally sold, and after everything, the taxes, the fees, your share came to just over $17,000. Walter sat down slowly at his kitchen table. Corinne's older sister, Miss Odessa, had passed the year before, childless, and had left what little she had split between her few remaining relatives. Walter hadn't expected much. He hadn't needed much. But $17,000 was $17,000, and Walter Higgins did not believe in leaving money sitting in strange accounts collecting strange fees. "I'll go to the bank Thursday," he told Jasmine. "Deposit it proper, put it toward the roof like your grandmother always wanted." "Do you want me to come with you?" Jasmine asked. There was something protective in her voice. She had always been protective of him, ever since she was a little girl trailing behind him in the garden, asking him 100 questions about everything. "I've been driving myself to the bank since before your mother was born," Walter said, and Jasmine laughed, because it was true, and because arguing with her grandfather about his independence was a fight she'd learned long ago not to pick. If she had come with him that Thursday, everything that followed might have gone differently. But she didn't. And so Walter Higgins drove alone, with $17,000 of his late sister-in-law's estate sitting in an envelope on his passenger seat, down a stretch of Route 9 that would become, within the hour, the site of the worst afternoon of his life, and the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple through an entire police department. Officer Doyle had been on the force for 6 years, and in that time, he developed a particular instinct, the kind of instinct that got him commendations from certain supervisors and quiet complaints filed against him by certain community members. He called it reading the road. His partner, a younger officer named Reyes, had a different word for it, though he rarely said it out loud. That Thursday afternoon, Doyle spotted the old green Buick a quarter-mile before he decided to follow it. An older vehicle, meticulously kept, moving 5 miles under the speed limit, cautious in a way that, to Doyle, read as suspicious rather than simply careful. "Watch this," Doyle said to Reyes, pulling out behind the Buick. "Watch what?" Reyes asked. "He's not doing anything." "That's exactly it," Doyle said, flipping on his lights. Walter saw the lights in his mirror and, without any anxiety, calmly signaled and pulled onto the shoulder. He had done nothing wrong. He had nothing to hide. Nearly 40 years of driving without so much as a parking ticket had taught him that when you are stopped for no clear reason, the wisest thing you can do is remain exactly, carefully yourself. Doyle approached the window with his hand resting near his belt, a posture he'd practiced until it felt natural. License and registration. Walter handed them over without a word, his hand steady. "Where you headed today, sir?" "The bank," Walter said. Doyle glanced past him, into the car, and his eyes landed on the manila envelope sitting on the passenger seat, thick and slightly bulging. "That your bank deposit?" "It is." "Mind if I ask how much?" Walter looked at him evenly. "I don't believe that's something I'm required to answer." It was a simple, true statement, and it was the moment everything shifted. Because to Officer Doyle, a black man in an old car, calmly declining to explain himself, was not a citizen exercising a right. It was a provocation. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Doyle said. What followed over the next several minutes is the kind of scene that, if you've ever seen it, you don't forget. Walter, standing quietly on the shoulder of the road while Doyle searched his car for officer safety, while Reyes stood a few feet back, uneasy, saying nothing. The envelope was found. Opened. The bills counted out loud, stack by stack, as if Walter's savings were evidence in a crime that hadn't happened. $17,340, Doyle said, whistling low. "That's a lot of cash for a man like you to be carrying around." "A man like me," Walter repeated, quietly, and something in his tone made Reyes shift his weight uncomfortably. "I've worked for every dollar of that money since before you were born, officer. It belongs to my late wife's estate. I have documentation, if you'd like to see it." "We'll be holding on to this," Doyle said instead, ignoring the offer entirely, "under civil asset forfeiture. You'll get a receipt. If it turns out to be clean, you can petition to get it back." This is the part of the story that tends to stop viewers cold, because it sounds like it shouldn't be legal, and yet, in more places than most people realize, it is. Civil asset forfeiture allows police to seize cash or property they merely suspect is connected to a crime, without ever charging the owner with one. The person doesn't need to be convicted. They don't even need to be arrested. They simply need to be unlucky enough to be carrying something an officer decides looks suspicious. Walter had heard of it. He had, in fact, once discussed it with the very man whose name he was about to invoke, the man on the other end of the phone call he was preparing to make. Standing there on the shoulder of Route 9, watching a stranger walk away with his late sister-in-law's estate folded into an evidence bag, Walter Higgins did something that would have surprised anyone who thought they understood him. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his old flip phone, and said, calmly, "You're going to want to make a phone call before you do anything with that money." Doyle laughed at him, called him old man. told him to save the theatrics. And this is where we came in. If you're finding yourself already leaning forward, wondering exactly who Walter is about to call, hold that feeling, because it's about to get a lot more complicated before it gets satisfying. But before we go further, if stories like this one, about ordinary people who turn out to carry more weight than anyone expects, are the kind of thing you enjoy, now's a good time to hit subscribe, because this channel is full of them. Jasmine got the call from her grandfather 40 minutes after the stop. Once Walter had been permitted to sit in his own car on the shoulder while paperwork was processed. His voice, when she picked up, was calm in the specific way that told her something was deeply wrong. Walter's calm always got quieter, not louder, the worse the situation became. They took the money, he told her. 17,000. Called it a forfeiture. Jasmine, sitting in her office downtown, felt something cold drop through her chest. She'd read about civil forfeiture cases in law school. She'd never expected to be fighting one for her own grandfather. Did they charge you with anything? No. Did they arrest you? No. Then they can't just, she stopped herself, because of course they could. That was the entire, infuriating point of the law as it was often applied. Okay, Grandpa, I'm coming to get you, and then we're going to fix this. By the time Jasmine arrived on Route 9, the paperwork was done, and Walter was free to go, that is, to drive home with an official receipt for $17,000 that was no longer his, in exchange for nothing but a case number and a stranger's signature. What Jasmine didn't know yet, what almost no one in Walter's daily life knew, was that her grandfather had already made a second phone call, not to a lawyer, not to a news station, to a number he hadn't dialed in nearly 4 years, saved under a single first name in his old flip phone's contact list, Marcus. To understand who Marcus was, and why a call to him mattered more than any lawyer Jasmine could hire, we have to go back nearly 30 years to a rainy October night when Walter Higgins, then a plant floor supervisor, found a terrified 19-year-old kid sitting alone in the break room after his shift, too afraid to go home because of trouble he'd fallen into with the wrong crowd. Walter hadn't asked questions that night. He'd simply made the kid a cup of coffee, sat with him until 2 in the morning, and then done something the kid never forgot. He vouched for him, got him a second chance at the plant when everyone else wanted him gone, told him, in the plainest words Walter knew how to say, that one bad chapter didn't have to be the whole book. That kid's name was Marcus Webb. Marcus never forgot that night, or the man who sat with him through it. He turned his life around, went back to school at 22, put himself through law school working nights, and built a career, first as a public defender, then a prosecutor, then a civil rights attorney who took on police accountability cases nobody else wanted to touch. 4 years ago, Marcus Webb had been sworn in as the state's attorney general, the chief law enforcement officer for the entire state, with direct oversight over exactly the kind of department that had just taken $17,000 from the man who once made him a cup of coffee at 2 in the morning. Walter had never once used that connection for himself, not for a parking ticket, not for a favor. He believed, deeply, that some things you don't cash in, you just carry, quietly, in case the day ever comes that truly calls for it. Standing on the shoulder of Route 9, watching a stranger count his savings out loud like evidence, Walter decided that day had finally come. Here's what makes this story more than a single bad afternoon on the side of a road. Because if it were only that, it would be tragic, but it wouldn't be the whole truth. Officer Doyle wasn't an aberration. He was a symptom. Over the following 2 days, while Jasmine filed emergency motions and requested documentation, a pattern began to surface. One that Jasmine, digging late into the night with the tenacity her grandfather had quietly instilled in her since childhood, started piecing together. Doyle's stops, it turned out, followed a pattern. A disproportionate number of forfeiture cases from his patrol route involved Black and Latino drivers, almost none of whom were ever formally charged with a crime. Complaints had been filed before, quietly closed, buried in a review process that seemed designed less to hold anyone accountable and more to make problems disappear on paper. Reyes, Doyle's partner, had said nothing that day on the shoulder of Route 9, but something about the encounter had stayed with him in a way previous stops hadn't. Maybe it was Walter's stillness. Maybe it was the specific, unbothered confidence with which the old man had said, "You're going to want to make a phone call." Whatever it was, Reyes found himself, 2 nights later, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, turning over a decision he knew could end his career either way, staying silent or finally speaking up. Meanwhile, Doyle, unaware that anything was unraveling, did what men in his position often do when they sense the ground might be shifting beneath them, even if they can't say why. He got ahead of the story. He mentioned to a few colleagues, and eventually to a friendly local reporter looking for a quick, easy piece, that he'd made a significant seizure connected to a possible fraud investigation, implying, without ever quite saying it outright, that the elderly man on Route 9 might not be as innocent as he seemed. It's a common tactic, and an ugly one. When you've wronged someone without power, you make sure the story that reaches the public isn't about what you did to them, but about what they supposedly did to deserve it. Walter heard about the article from a neighbor. He read it once, quietly, at his kitchen table, and set the paper down without comment. Jasmine, when she found out, wanted to call the reporter, the department, anyone who would listen. Walter told her to wait. Let them dig their hole a little deeper first, he said. People like that always do, if you give them enough time. What neither Doyle nor the reporter knew was that by the time that article printed, Marcus Webb's office had already opened a preliminary inquiry. Not loudly, not publicly, but with the quiet, methodical thoroughness of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how these departments tried to protect their own. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you'd been in Reyes's position that day, watching your partner take an old man's life savings on a hunch, saying nothing in the moment, what would it take for you to finally speak up? Drop your honest answer in the comments, because it's the kind of question this story is really asking. 6 days after the stop, Officer Doyle arrived at the precinct to find a manila folder waiting on his desk, a small, unremarkable object that would end up mattering more than almost anything else in his career. Inside was a formal notice, an internal affairs review, requested directly by the Attorney General's Civil Rights Division, regarding a pattern of forfeiture stops on Route 9 over the preceding 18 months. Doyle read the letter twice, his stomach tightening with each pass. Attorney General's office. Not a routine review. Not a local complaint quietly filed and forgotten. Someone with real authority had reached down into his precinct and pulled a thread, and he had no idea why or how. He didn't know yet that the answer was sitting quietly in a brick house on Ashford Street, tending tomato plants, waiting. What Doyle also didn't know was that Reyes had, 3 days earlier, made his own quiet call, not to Doyle, not to their supervisor, but directly to the Internal Affairs hotline, providing a full, honest account of the stop, the search, and the pattern he'd noticed but never reported. It wasn't an easy call to make. Reyes had spent the 2 nights before replaying, over and over, the specific stillness in Walter's eyes as Doyle mocked him. A look that wasn't fear, but something closer to disappointment, the kind that lands heavier than anger ever could. Meanwhile, Jasmine had done what good lawyers do, built the case brick by brick. Bank records showing the estate transfer, documentation of Miss Odessa's will, a sworn statement establishing the money's origin beyond any reasonable doubt. She filed everything not with a local court, where these things could sit for months, but directly with the Attorney General's Civil Asset Forfeiture Oversight Unit. The unit Marcus Webb had personally created 3 years earlier, specifically because he'd seen, again and again, how ordinary people were quietly robbed by a process most of them didn't even know existed. When Marcus Webb's office cross-referenced the case number on the seized funds with the complainant's name, Walter Higgins, and matched it against an old personnel file from decades earlier, listing a young supervisor's name as a character reference for a 19-year-old employee named Marcus Webb, the Attorney General closed his office door for the rest of the afternoon. He didn't need anyone to explain the story to him. He'd lived a version of it once, on a rainy night in a break room, over a cup of coffee he never forgot. By the end of that week, what had started as a single traffic stop had become something much larger. A formal high-priority review into an entire department's forfeiture practices, personally overseen by the state's chief law enforcement officer, triggered by the one stop out of hundreds that happened, by pure chance, to touch a man Marcus Webb would have done almost anything for. Doyle still had no idea any of this was happening. That ignorance was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday, in a conference room at the State Attorney General's regional office, sterile, fluorescent lit. entirely unremarkable in appearance. And yet, for Officer Doyle, it would turn out to be one of the most consequential rooms he ever walked into. He arrived expecting a routine administrative review, the kind he'd sailed through twice before with a shrug and a signature. He wore his dress uniform, practiced a calm, faintly bored expression in the elevator mirror, and walked in prepared to explain away a seizure he still, genuinely, believed had been justified. He was not prepared for who was sitting at the head of the table. Marcus Webb didn't raise his voice when Doyle walked in. He didn't need to. He simply gestured to the empty chair across from him and said, evenly, "Officer Doyle, thank you for coming. I'd like to walk through the stop on Route 9 from the 11th, if you don't mind." Doyle sat, and for the first several minutes, gave the same account he'd given before: suspicious behavior, an uncooperative citizen, a justified seizure under standard procedure. It was the same story that had worked for him a dozen times over 6 years. It did not work this time. Marcus Webb listened to the entire account without interrupting, and then, calmly, began asking questions that Doyle had no good answers for. Why had he run no criminal check before initiating the stop? Why the search had extended to personal financial documents with no articulable suspicion of a specific crime? Why, of the last 31 forfeiture cases on his record, 28 involved Black or Latino drivers, and only 2 had ever resulted in a criminal charge of any kind? Doyle's composure, so practiced in that elevator mirror, began to crack. "With respect, sir," Doyle said, his voice tightening, "I don't see how one stop justifies this kind of—" "It doesn't," Marcus said. "The other 27 do." It was at this point in the hearing that the door opened, and Walter Higgins walked in, with Jasmine beside him. Doyle turned, and for a long, silent moment, simply stared. Because there, standing quietly in the doorway of the Attorney General's own conference room, was the old man from the side of the road, the one he'd mocked for making a phone call, the one he'd assumed had nothing behind him but an empty threat. "Mr. Higgins," Marcus said, and something in his voice softened, just slightly, in a way that made Doyle's stomach drop even further. "Thank you for coming in." "Marcus," Walter said, nodding, in a tone so plain and familiar that it told Doyle everything he needed to know before another word was spoken. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't luck. This was a debt being paid, 30 years in the making, and Doyle had unknowingly placed himself directly in its path. "You two know each other," Doyle said, his voice smaller than he intended. "Officer Doyle," Marcus said, turning back to him, his tone now entirely without warmth. "Mr. Higgins gave me a chance when I was 19 years old and had no right to expect one. I don't forget things like that. And I especially don't forget them when I find out someone treated him the way you did, over $17,000 that belonged to him and his late wife's family, without so much as running a records check." The rest of the hearing did not take long. Doyle's account collapsed under its own inconsistencies. Reyes's earlier statement to Internal Affairs, honest and detailed, corroborated everything Jasmine had already documented. By the end of the afternoon, Doyle was placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full disciplinary review, a review that, given the pattern uncovered, was expected to end his career entirely and very possibly expose him to personal civil liability for the string of seizures behind him. Reyes, by contrast, was commended for coming forward, transferred to a different division, and given the kind of second chance that Walter Higgins had quietly believed in his entire life. The idea that people who tell the truth, even late, even imperfectly, deserve the chance to do better. 3 weeks later, Walter Higgins sat once again at his kitchen table on Ashford Street, except this time, the manila envelope in front of him held not just his original $17,000, but an additional sum, statutory interest, and a formal settlement the state had agreed to rather than risk a civil rights lawsuit Jasmine had made clear she was fully prepared to file. There was a written apology, too, on official letterhead, though Walter read it only once and set it aside without much ceremony. He had never been chasing an apology. He'd been chasing something closer to fairness, the simple, stubborn belief that people should be treated according to who they actually are, not who someone else assumes them to be at first glance. The department, under the Attorney General's direct order, underwent a full audit of its forfeiture practices. New policies were implemented requiring documented, individualized suspicion before any seizure, along with mandatory quarterly reporting broken down by race, reviewed directly by Marcus Webb's Civil Rights Division. It wasn't a perfect fix. Walter, of all people, understood that no single case ever fixes a broken system entirely. But it was real, it was enforceable, and it meant that the next person pulled over on Route 9 with a bank envelope on their passenger seat would not be at the mercy of one officer's assumptions. Jasmine visited that Sunday, the way she always did, and found her grandfather out on the porch, sweeping it, even though it didn't need it. "You could have told me about Marcus," she said, sitting down on the step beside him. "This whole time, Walter kept sweeping, unhurried. Wasn't my story to tell, until it needed telling. Some things you carry quietly, Jasmine. You don't cash them in unless the moment truly calls for it. And even then," he paused, looking out at the street, "you do it because it's right, not because you're owed something. And if that officer had just apologized on the side of the road, if he'd just treated you decent from the start." Walter finally stopped sweeping and looked at her, something gentle in his tired eyes. "Then none of this would have happened, and I'd have been just fine with that too. I never wanted to prove a point, Jasmine. I wanted my money back, and I wanted to be treated like a man instead of a suspicion. Everything else was just what it took to get there." Jasmine looked at him for a long moment, then asked the question that had been sitting with her since the hearing. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't known Marcus? If there'd been no phone call, no history, nobody in a position to listen?" Walter set the broom against the porch rail and sat down beside her. "Every day," he said. "That's exactly why I fought. Not for me. I'll be gone one day, and that money won't matter to me anymore. I fought because somewhere out there right now, there's another Walter Higgins standing on the side of some road, and he doesn't have a Marcus to call. He's just got the truth and a badge standing in front of him, deciding whether the truth matters." He looked out at the street, quiet, resolute. That's who this was really for. Officer Doyle was formally terminated 2 months later, stripped of his badge and barred from serving in law enforcement anywhere in the state. Reyes, the partner who found his courage 2 nights too late, but found it all the same, went on to train incoming officers on exactly the kind of encounter he once stayed silent through, determined that the next young officer standing on a roadside would know the difference between suspicion and prejudice before it cost someone everything. And Walter Higgins went back to his tomato plants, his flannel shirts, his Sunday porch sweeping. An ordinary man again, by choice, not because the world had made him small, but because he'd never needed to be anything else to matter. They stole his money because they looked at him and saw nothing worth protecting. What they never bothered to ask was who was protecting him back. If this story moved you, that's exactly why it needed to be told. Because justice doesn't always arrive with sirens and headlines. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a phone call an old man was patient enough to make and powerful enough, in the end, to be believed.